Tonight, I'm opening files related to a single experiment: what compound interest did to $100 over 30 years. This isn't theory pulled from a textbook. These are real logs, documented and preserved, every mistake, every lesson, and every quiet surprise along the way. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Profit with A and hit the notification bell. What we uncover here could be the blueprint for your own financial growth, and you won't want to miss the next file we open. File Profit 701, the first deposit. It was the spring of 1991. I was fresh out of school, broke, but stubbornly optimistic. I had a $10 bill folded into my wallet and 90 more tucked in a drawer. That $100 wasn't much, it was supposed to be for emergencies. But one evening, sitting in my small rented room with a lamp flickering above me, I decided to test something I had only read about: compound interest. I walked into a local bank with that $100 in my pocket. My hands were sweaty, the bills felt flimsy. The teller asked if I wanted a savings account or just to hold cash. I said, savings. I signed my name, got a flimsy booklet, and watched her stamp the first entry, $100. The truth? Nothing happened. Not for weeks, not for months. Each visit to the bank felt anticlimactic. The interest at the time was low, and all I saw were pennies added. Pennies. I remember thinking, did I just lock away my emergency cash for nothing? Friends laughed when I told them. I almost pulled it out more than once. But then, 1 year later, I saw something odd in that booklet. The pennies had grown, not just from my deposit, but from the pennies before them. The first taste of compounding. The balance had shifted upward without me touching it. It was small, but it was proof. Time was doing the heavy lifting. I walked home that day with a strange calm. My $100 wasn't making me rich, but it was quietly working, even when I wasn't. That was a new kind of win. At Profit with A, we classify this as the seed file, the case that proved growth doesn't shout, it whispers. But $100 sitting alone wasn't enough. I realized compounding only works if you give it fuel. That's when I tested what would happen if I fed it, bit by bit, year after year. File Profit 702, Feeding the Fund. By 1995, 4 years had passed. I was working an entry-level job that barely covered rent. My paycheck felt like it evaporated the moment it hit my account. But I held onto the habit. Every month, no matter how tight things got, I slipped $5 into that savings account. It started small, just an extra $5, sometimes $10. I'd walk to the bank, hand it over, and get another stamp in that little booklet. The teller started recognizing me, still growing it, she'd smile. The slow burn, struggles and learning curve. There were months I nearly broke the streak. A car repair. A missed bill. Times when $5 felt impossible. I thought about quitting. After all, what difference could $5 make? But I pushed through. Some months I even deposited coins I had rolled myself. One day I noticed something subtle but powerful. The new deposits weren't just adding to the balance, they were feeding the interest. The pennies I was earning were stacking on top of each other faster. The snowball wasn't rolling fast, but it was moving. By the end of that decade, my $100 seed had become several hundred, not because of sudden wealth, but because of relentless trickles. It felt boring, yes, but also unstoppable. At Profit with A, we call this a momentum file, the lesson that tiny, consistent inputs make compounding visible. But habits alone weren't enough. Interest rates shifted, technology changed, and I realized I needed to explore new vehicles for growth. The jar had become a bank account. The bank account needed to become something more. File profit, 703, when interest rates fell. By the early 2000s, things had changed. I had a slightly better job, a little more breathing room, and a small cushion in that savings account. But the world had shifted, interest rates had dropped. Suddenly, the steady growth I had counted on felt like it had slowed to a crawl. I remember checking my booklet and seeing numbers that looked stuck in place. That frustration led me to explore. I started reading about certificates of deposit, mutual funds, and other places where money could grow faster. I didn't know much, but I was curious. So, I did what I had done before, I experimented. I moved a portion of my savings into a one-year CD with a slightly higher rate. At first, it felt like a mistake. Locking my money away meant no quick access, and the gains still looked small compared to what I imagined in my head. I second-guessed myself constantly. Friends told me I should just spend it. What's the point of a few extra dollars a year, they asked. But when that CD matured, I saw the numbers in black and white. The return was higher than my basic account, and the extra growth layered onto my original deposits. The math finally clicked. Even small adjustments in where your money sits can change the entire curve of compounding over time. It wasn't glamorous. I wasn't suddenly wealthy. But the small shift taught me something crucial: compound interest isn't just about time. It's about finding the right conditions to let time do its best work. At Profit with A, we tag this as a leverage file, proof that even tiny adjustments in environment accelerate the compounding process. But curiosity didn't stop there. CDs were safe, but I started hearing whispers about something riskier: investing in the market. That's when the journey took a bigger turn. File profit, 704, my first market test. It was 2005. I had been watching the news, reading articles, and overhearing conversations about how the stock market builds wealth. To me, it sounded like gambling. I didn't grow up around investing. I didn't know anyone who owned stocks. But I kept thinking, if compound interest worked in a savings account, what would it look like in the market? I took the leap. I opened my very first brokerage account and transferred a small piece of my savings, just $500. My hands shook as I clicked buy on a low-cost index fund. I didn't really understand all the charts, but I trusted the concept of long-term growth. The first year was rough. Some days the number on my screen dropped by $10 or $20, and my stomach sank with it. I checked obsessively, refreshing the page like it was social media. Fear almost made me sell. Every dip felt like proof I had made a mistake. But by the second year, the picture changed. The small gains from dividends reinvested automatically, and the share price inched upward. My $500 became $530, then $560. Not dramatic, but steady. I realized I didn't have to do anything. The money was working, the interest was compounding, and the snowball was bigger than it had ever been. That moment shifted my mindset. This wasn't gambling, it was patience on a larger scale. The lesson was clear: when you put compound interest into an engine like the stock market, the effect multiplies, but so does the emotional test of holding on. At Profit with A, we mark this as an expansion file, the point where compounding left the safety of savings and entered the volatility of the market. By then, my $100 had transformed into a living experiment across banks, CDs, and now the market. But the journey was far from smooth, because not every year was kind to investors. File Profit 705, The Crash Years. It was 2008. The headlines screamed crisis. I was older now, with a little more saved and invested, and for the first time, my compounding machine didn't feel unstoppable, it felt fragile. Every news report showed red arrows pointing down. The market was falling, and with it, my balance. I logged into my brokerage account one morning and saw numbers that almost made me sick. What had once been over $3,000 had dropped by nearly half. Years of steady deposits and patience seemed erased in weeks. I panicked. I thought about pulling everything out, going back to the safety of a basic savings account. My stomach tightened every time I checked the news. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, asking myself, was this all a waste? But then I remembered the principle that had carried me this far: compounding only works when you give it time. Pulling out meant locking in the loss. Holding meant I still had a chance. So I held. Slowly, painfully, I stopped checking the account every day. I focused on making my next deposit, even if it was small. It took years, but eventually, the numbers climbed back. And when they did, they climbed faster than before. What I thought was the end of growth was actually a reset, a chance to buy more at lower prices, and let compounding work harder later. At Profit with A, we call this a resilience file, the reminder that compounding isn't a straight line. The dips are brutal, but survival is part of the math. But the crash left me cautious. I wanted safety again. That's when I revisited an old habit, automation, and how small systems can keep growth alive even when fear sets in. File Profit 706, Automating the Snowball. By 2010, the dust had settled. The market was recovering, but I was still scarred from the crash. I knew if I relied on emotion, I'd make the wrong choice. So, I built a system. I set up automatic transfers, small ones, $25 every month, directly into my investment account. No decision making, no manual deposits, no should I or shouldn't I. Just a rule: every month, money moved, whether I felt like it or not. At first, it felt insignificant. $25. That was barely dinner money. I wondered if it mattered at all. But I reminded myself, this was the same logic as slipping $5 into the bank in the 90s. The deposits might be tiny, but the habit was huge. Within a few years, the results shocked me. Those small transfers had snowballed into thousands. Dividends reinvested, markets grew, and the automatic rhythm meant I didn't miss opportunities, even when I wasn't paying attention. Automation took willpower out of the equation. It protected me from fear, from hesitation, and from the temptation to spend instead of invest. It was discipline without thought. At Profit with A, we mark this as a system file, proof that automation builds consistency, and consistency fuels compounding. But automation only works if the engine behind it is strong. The next file is about how I learned to diversify that engine, so the snowball wasn't rolling in just one direction. File Profit 707, 30 years later. By 2021, 30 years had passed since I first carried that $100 to the bank counter. I was no longer the kid with sweaty palms and a flimsy booklet. Life had changed, jobs, homes, responsibilities, but one thing had stayed constant: the quiet discipline of letting money grow. On the 30th anniversary, I pulled every statement, every log, every file I had kept. I wanted to see the full picture, what 30 years of compound interest had really done to that small seed. As I laid it all out, the memories came back, the doubts, the near withdrawals, the panic during crashes, the tiny deposits that felt like nothing. 30 years of not being sure if it was even working. And then the number stared back at me. What started as $100 had grown into tens of thousands, without windfalls, without inheritance, without magic. Just deposits, patience, and time. The snowball that once looked like a handful of pennies had become something heavy, something powerful. It wasn't just about the money. It was the realization that compounding had mirrored my own life. Growth came slowly, painfully, and then suddenly. The $100 wasn't the story, the discipline was. The waiting was. At Profit with A, we classify this as the legacy file, proof that time is the greatest multiplier, and the quietest habits are the ones that echo loudest over decades. And with that, the final file closes, not as an ending, but as evidence of what small beginnings can become when patience meets persistence. These files all tell the same truth. From the first shaky deposit of $100, to feeding the fund with 5s and 10s, to weathering the crash years and setting up systems that ran without me, compound interest proved itself over and over. It wasn't quick. It wasn't flashy. Most of the time it was boring, pennies added to pennies, dollars feeding dollars. But over 3 decades, that boring rhythm became a snowball too big to ignore. What compound interest did to my $100 wasn't about numbers on a screen, it was about patience, persistence, and the discipline to stay the course when it would have been easier to quit. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Don't wait for the right amount to start. Begin with whatever you have, because the first deposit, no matter how small, is proof that the door is open. The secret isn't in finding a shortcut. The secret is giving time something to work with. If you've started your own saving or investing journey, drop your story in the comments. I might feature it in a future Profit log. And if you found these files useful, subscribe to Profit with A, hit the notification bell, and join me the next time we open another file. This has been a productive one from Profit with A. Until next time, keep hustling.